Thank you all for being here. And I have to say, we had the chance this morning listening to other speakers, and it was really rewarding and quite exciting. And I'm also thrilled that I'm sitting here with two very close friends of mine, Rolf Meyer and Ibrahim. I should say Ibrahim is a more recent friend through Rolf in the last 5 years, when he was an ambassador in Washington from South Africa. And Rolf and I have known each other for 25 years. Just actually before the official elections where Nelson Mandela and the ANC took power in 1994. And I'll mention a bit about how I got to know Rolf. But let me just say, so we can get into a conversation. So Beyond Conflict was started 25 years ago in the transitions in Central and Eastern Europe on a pretty basic, I would like to think humbling, but I think important insight, that there is shared human experience around the world. To me then, it wasn't rocket science, it was pretty basic, but there were a lot of people here in the United States and elsewhere who thought people can't learn from the experience of others. There really is no cross-cultural learning, that everybody's experience is unique and different. And then you would hear from people who had lived under repression or conflict, who for a different set of reasons would also think they couldn't learn from the experience of others. Because when you live under violence or repression, and you don't have to live in South Africa or Northern Ireland to experience this. You could live anywhere in our communities. That if you become a victim, you think your situation is unique. That nobody can understand your suffering. And therefore you can't learn from, or that others can't connect to what you've gone through. And I often have said that over these 25 years, we're like a big support group on wheels. We bring in people like Rolf and Ibrahim, who have been once really bitter enemies, who have struggled with change. We believe that change is possible, but being very human and pragmatic, we know it's not easy. You know, we're sort of wired for homeostasis as a species. But at the same time, change does happen. And we can see it in the ending of apartheid and all the other countries that both Rolf and Ibrahim, with us and with others, have brought that experience. So for these 25 years, we have been bringing from South Africa and dozens of countries around the world, leaders at different levels who have been former enemies and became friends. You know, combatants, paramilitaries, civil society, you know, all the different elements of people who are involved in really struggling through transformation and change. You know, I often say that there are no unique conflicts, but every conflict will have its own unique characteristics. And over these 25 years, we keep on looking for paradigms or keep on pushing and saying, what are we missing? What is it about the human experience that will give us yet another toolkit beyond personal experience to show people that change is indeed possible? More recently, we've been working with behavioral scientists at MIT and elsewhere to sort of bring out of not only behavioral science, but evolutionary biology, what is it to be human? How do we think? And we're now at the stage where we're bringing that together with this direct shared experience to try to reframe how we think about these fundamental challenges. So for these 25 years, we have worked in nearly 75 countries and brought Rolf and Ibrahim and many others to share their experience, and not one-off. I think in Northern Ireland, we did 30 initiatives over a decade. We more recently worked in Bahrain. We worked in the Basque conflict and many others. And the same with Ibrahim, working on Cuba and the opening in Cuba. And we keep on looking. And over the last few years, I've been hearing from Rolf and Ibrahim, even before this recent election, you need to start focusing on your own country. There are some profound challenges and things that we have seen from our own experience that we see happening in the United States. And I remember thinking, well, at some point we probably will have to do something. And now we're here at this stage. And I don't mean literally at this stage, I guess both figuratively and literally on this stage, and at the stage as a nation. And I often say that maybe the last 25 years of my experience has been to prepare me with my friends and networks to bring it home to the United States. What is the nature of division? What is the nature of dehumanization? What is the nature of fear? But also, what is the nature of hope and change? What is it when you humanize the other? What is it to really connect with another person in the midst of horrible, horrible repression or a system like apartheid? Eric mentioned that Rolf, was a privileged son of Afrikaner South Africa. And Rolf will talk a bit about how he recognized the need for change. And so with that, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation, I'm going to first go to Rolf. And maybe Rolf, initially, when you were telling me, and this was years ago, I see things happening in your country that concern me, maybe you might want to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to be here. And thank you to the organizers who have invited us to travel all the way from South Africa. I think, as you have heard from Eric, well, let me take one step back. Our discussion is about change at the personal level and change at the public level. And as you've heard from Eric, I was born into apartheid. It was not by choice, but that is how it happened to be when I was born. South Africa was under apartheid rule at that stage, and it was like that for almost 300 years by then. And the question was, at what stage in my personal observation would it have been possible to make or to start a process of change? Now, I can recall that the first real observations I made, and let me take one step again back to say, I was a student leader when I was at university, Afrikaans student leader. If I look back at the pronouncements I made at that stage, this was late 1960s, early 1970s, I'm ashamed for what I said, because that was my firm belief. But looking back at it, I can't believe that that was my belief. Now, by the mid-70s, I think my own process of change started, and I started to observe in my own mind that what we have on a law book in South Africa is just unacceptable, prescribing the way in which black people should live. And by the way, he is for all practical purposes also black. That is how the laws described people of colored orientation in South Africa. And so at that stage, when I was a young lawyer in the mid-1970s, this thing at the back of my mind was starting to get at me, and I had to respond. I nevertheless went into politics as a member of the national apartheid government or party at the time. Later on, I became a deputy minister and deputy minister of police, inter alia. That was at the time that he was a real troublemaker.
Still is.
Instigator is the word.
Instigator. So he was put in jail like many others in South Africa. We had a state of emergency at that time, a national state of emergency. Actually, that lasted for 5 years. I was part of that period, deputy minister of police. But like Eric was referring to it, it was also during that period that my own conviction started to speed up in terms of change. And the fact that I had to expose myself, my own experience, to what was going on in the real life of black people in South Africa, through that responsibility that I had to exercise, I think helped me to force me to make this change, to take the leap, to change from a person that came from this apartheid background to somebody who's on the other side of the political persuasion. And we don't have the time now to talk more about that, but in the end, I described it as a paradigm shift that I went through. And what I know about that is it's not something that you can really only intellectually adopt, that paradigm shift. It has to come from here as well. And that is why I enjoyed so much listening to Stephanie this morning, because I found links with what she had said this morning and describing her thinking about this. And I can find a link to that. What I'm basically now saying is that change is something that all of us have to be challenged with at some point in our lives, whether we are political representatives or whether it's at the social level in terms of relationships. And I think all countries need to face that consequence of the challenge of change at the relevant time.
Instigator, Ibrahim, would you say a few things about what you were seeing happening here in this country, but also from your own experience in South Africa, and what are the challenges there you see as well?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I want to really say that one thing I hold against Rolf, more than him overseeing my period in prison was the fact that I was supposed to get married in 1987, but I was still in prison then. So I should be married for 30 years now, but I'm only married for 29 years. So I lost a year of my life.
No love lost.
No love lost. But the fact of the matter is that I came here in 2010. That was the time when Barack Obama was president. We had been attuned, for example, in South Africa, to really detect levels of disrespect, levels of racism. And I found the ease with which news presenters could speak about former President Bush and Barack Obama. And we saw the early signs of that kind of disrespect. I thought that that was a recipe for eventual trouble because it speaks about someone who may have been tolerated but not always accepted. And we saw ways in which I think he almost received a hospital pass. It was a safe pass to send him into the White House at a time of profound crisis within this country that was, in a sense, generating what I think happened in 2016. And reflecting on our time in South Africa, I thought that there were pockets of victims, pockets of resistance in the United States. Things were happening to Muslims. Things were happening to African Americans by the police. Things were happening, deportations of Hispanics. Things were happening to the LGBT. Things were happening, but every group was wallowing in their own victimhood, monopolizing victimhood, having competitions, Olympics, about who was the greatest victim of America. And the lesson we learned in South Africa was that unless we came together, we would not be able to stand up to what was happening. And the more we don't mainstream that resistance, take the center stage of our society and take the battle, in figurative terms, to the National Party, we would not be able to defeat what is ultimately the enemy of all bigotries, rather than tackle individual bigotries. That was our favorite cherry-picked bigotry. And so I think that that still is elusive as I look at the United States. That I don't think that Black Lives Matter, the Muslims, the Hispanic National Council, this, that, the other, the LGBT, are finding those points of connection in the same way that I think we found it. The second thing is that we refused in South Africa to personalize our enemies. Mandela always taught us that our enemy was a system, even if it was represented by hateful figures. We refused to become what we hated, makers of caricatures. And so I see the mistake about turning Trump into the big caricature and missing the systemic things in our society. We went for the system and not the people, and that's why Rolf and I can be friends today, because we were taught not to hate the individuals who carry out certain things, but to aim our fire at the system, at the systemic, policy, legislative things that needed to be fought. And I think that, as a bit of an advice, that's something that I think the United States citizenry should be able to look. Don't get caught. Don't get caught up by Trump mania because you're missing the big thing. Hateful as he is, in my opinion. But don't get caught up in it because you are not making systemic changes and you are not finding connections with others who are equal, maybe lesser, sometimes bigger victims of you, of the system. And so that was absolutely important. And the third thing that I think struck me was, what is a definition of courage when you are faced by something going so horribly wrong? And I take the Kantian version of courage, which we applied in South Africa. Courage is not the opposite of cowardice. The opposite of cowardice is recklessness. Courage is the perfect middle. It is the ability to stand up when things are wrong and not to be a coward, but at the same time, it is the ability to stand up against reckless elements also who oppose it, because they mislead you. And therefore, that becomes the important thing, and that is what kept the anti-apartheid struggle, a struggle that was always in the middle, never going to the extremes, never dehumanizing ourselves and others, and always looking for the human connections with others. I believe this is the moment in the United States of America that you need to discover your own points of courage, your own connections, your own coalitions, and to transcend your own victimhood, and to not fall into Trump mania, because that is the ultimate distraction that I think that you are facing.
Ibrahim, you raised a question about awareness. So Nelson Mandela, yourself, and many other ANC leaders made the point, even before Mandela got out of prison, that we had to separate the Afrikaner people from the apartheid system, meaning we couldn't hold the Afrikaners collectively responsible for apartheid because they'd be so emotionally burdened. And they had nowhere else to go. They were the only white tribe of the continent. But you also just said something, Rolf, that for you, it was your increasing awareness of what it was to be an African in South Africa. And one of the challenges we have in this country is most white Americans don't have friends who are African American. And the reality is, there are a lot of well-meaning white Americans who are not aware of the daily lived discrimination and the accumulation of these slights and some profound economic realities. And I know where I live in Boston, the Federal Reserve Bank 2 years ago did a study on the color of wealth in the greater Boston area. For a white family, median wealth is $248,000. For a Latino family, it's $3,000. And for an African American family, it is $8. And I can give you other very disturbing statistics. But when I queried my friends who are white, and I point that out, they're not aware of that. They see what happens in Ferguson, they see what happens on the news when horrible incidents happen, but change, from what I hear you saying, is also the awareness on both sides of the lived reality of the other. The embodied lived experience of the other side. And for you, Rolf, I remember you telling me once, somebody asked you, what was it like in the days leading up where you actually negotiated away power? You said you felt great anxiety. Can you maybe talk about that, and then what you felt after you actually signed the agreement?
Well, I think it was this drive, being convinced that we have to find a new future. We had the ability to define that new future as well. That it was this anxiety of knowing we have to go there, but we were not absolutely certain about what that end result would be. But then the relief when we actually made the agreement, and I will never forget that moment. I still get goosebumps when I think about it. In 1993, when we made the agreement and it was signed by Mandela and de Klerk, and I could go out and say, this was my moment of liberation as well, because I could unshackle myself, if that's the right word, from the past and open into this new future. And that helped me to cross that divide of where we were in the past, that line that was dividing us into a new joint future, a democratic future. But I think what is important in this regard, and latching on to what Ibrahim was saying, you know, the root and the basis of apartheid in South Africa, which I think is a fundamental problem that you find elsewhere in the world too, is the notion of superiority versus inferiority. Some people think they are better than others. Some people think they are better qualified, they are richer, or whatever. They are just superior to others. And what we had to scrap in South Africa, what we had to eradicate, was essentially that fundamental root of the problem. Because for 300 years we were coming with that problem. Whites, Europeans that came to our part of the continent, and for so many years thought they are superior. And once we succeeded in eradicating that paradigm, we could replace it with one where we're saying we're all equal. We are seriously on the same platform. And that is the difference which we managed in our lifetime, and which we were very fortunate, Ibrahim and I, to participate in our country. And I wish others could share more directly in that experience elsewhere where you find the same problem. I've observed this problem in so many places that you have mentioned, in Latin America, in Asia, in the rest of Africa. I'm doing work right now in Central African Republic, in Sudan and South Sudan and all those places, and everywhere it's this thing. Even between tribes and tribes, between ethnic communities and ethnic communities. One think they are superior to the other.
And you talk about inclusion in between these comments. And I remember a friend of mine from Guatemala told me years ago that all conflict is fundamentally driven by exclusion. And I remember Rolf telling me early on that the reason why the South African negotiated agreement worked with all the issues that the country is facing today is because it was inclusive. And you know, we tend to look at South Africa from the outside as sort of motherhood and apple pie, that all these iconic figures. But the process you talked about in South Africa was not like you started day one, we know what inclusion looks like, let's put it to work. You struggled, both sides struggled. More people died, if I recall, from the day Nelson Mandela was released until you signed the agreement than the previous decades. And so when we look at inclusion, not as a sort of theoretical construct or as purely aspirational, for both of you, what does inclusion really mean in a way that we could think about it in this country? Maybe with Ibrahim.
You know, in South Africa, in the Zulu language, the greeting is not hi or hello. It's not peace and how are you. The greeting is sawubona. I see you. You see, inclusion at its essence is seeing someone else not as a caricature, but as a real person, finding a human connection. And therefore, we have a mantra in South Africa, when in doubt, include. And so people made fun of us when we wrote a constitution that recognized 11 languages. But why have one when you have this wonderful diversity of languages that everyone on their deathbed, in the hospital, in the court, when they're fighting for their life, needs to speak in the language that they are, and the courts must give a translator. We are the country with the most number of colors in our flag, 6. But it's a convergence of so many different traditions we have been contending before, but now flowing into one. We are a country that has an anthem that includes 5 languages, never repeating itself. But every community sees themselves in that language. And so when in doubt, include. Whereas I think that you may be suffering from an assimilative drive, become like us, become the same as us, whereas there may be a wonderful world of diversity waiting for you. And I think that when you have that kind of inclusiveness, you have this cacophony of debate and argumentation where the media and the people and civil society and the sermons at mosques and churches all speak today about how bad our president is. And no one goes to jail because it's part of the fundamental inclusion. If you can include on the smaller levels, you can include on the fundamental levels that are there. And I think that that's what it really means, and it comes back to this notion of seeing each other. So that identity politics never become the domain of the scoundrels. Because scoundrels retreat into identity politics when they see these fissures of exclusion. They enter an echo chamber in which they say, I know you don't feel at home. Come with me. I will make you great again.
One of the things that we're going to be doing, and both Ibrahim and Rolf will be participating as authors, is in a book that we've been asked to do that we're calling Letters to America. And the idea of the book is to say, if you had a chance to write a letter to the American people, what would you tell them at this stage? What would you tell them at this moment when we heard today, we've heard in many places, how do we understand this moment? Where do we go from here? How do we avoid the mistakes that are going to play into further division? And let me just turn to you, Rolf, as we come to the near closing. What would you as you begin to write your chapter and your letter, what would you say?
I came to your country the first time in 1982, long before the birth of some of you. But there was something that I took away from that message, from that visit. That was almost a prescription for me going back to South Africa at the time of apartheid, etc. And that was that this is a country, and by the way, 1982 was during the time of Reagan, if I remember correctly. But what I observed, and I had the opportunity to travel abroad on a broad basis through the country and learn lots of people, came to know lots of people, and observed deeply what was going on in American society at that stage. And I took away this message, and that was, this is a practicing democracy. And what I would like to put in my letter is, go back to those roots of your existence. I read a lot about how this democracy came about. I'm an admirer of Jefferson forever, and others who were the founding spiritual and other founders of your nation. What is in your constitution from the beginning was for us something to follow. And my problem today is I don't see it. I don't see what is happening, like Abraham is saying. What is happening currently here is not an example for us. We have a bad example right now back in South Africa. But I can't look up to the US to say, that is better. I'm sorry to say, but that is the message that we have to convey. Let's go back to those fundamentals that can help your society and our society, and the whole world for that matter.
I was asked in South Africa, what do I think of Trump? And I said, well, America was asleep and Trump is the alarm clock. And I would urge you, make the next election not an election of candidates, but a referendum of who you are, what you stand for, where you are going to, what you see for the world and what you see for yourselves. Make that, never mind who the candidates are, make that the fundamental question you are answering. I would go further and say that as the United States, I have heard US leaders quote their constitution like Osama bin Laden quoted the Quran. No context, no progression, and no interpretation that is upgraded. Jefferson wrote to James Madison when he was drafting the Constitution, and he said, remember, when you draft any law or constitution, make sure that it can be updated every 19 years, because in that period, the majority who approved it have died, and a new majority has emerged, and therefore the right to bear arms and all of those kind of things are anachronisms. It's an app that is waiting to be upgraded.
Well, with that, I'm going to thank all of you and my two colleagues, and I have a minute, and I will just say that when Rolf talked about the new Constitution and his paradigm shift, I like to remind people, imagine in 1961 if George Wallace had stood on the steps of the state capitol in Alabama and said that all whites and African Americans in this state are equal people. People would have been shocked. But for Rolf in the early 90s to be standing and say, we need a constitution where we are all equal, is as profound a transition. And let's not forget that that was profound transformation. And so I'm excited as an American who has worked with these friends and others to bring this experience back home. And I think everything we heard today just resonated. So with that, thank you for giving us the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.